Jack Brenner is a struggling handyman living in a leaking trailer, barely making ends meet. With winter coming and bills piling up, he's desperate for work. That's when he finds a mysterious job posting: repair a remote mountain cabin in exchange for food and shelter. The job seems perfect until Jack meets the cabin owner. Camille Drake appears to be just another wealthy woman seeking privacy, but she's actually a billionaire tech mogul hiding from a world that betrayed her. What starts as a simple handyman job becomes something neither of them expected. Jack works on the cabin while Camille discovers what it feels like to be treated like a regular person. Shared meals and quiet conversations slowly break down the walls they've both built around their hearts. But when Jack learns who Camille really is, everything changes. She offers him a new life, but can a struggling handyman trust a woman whose world operates by completely different rules? What happens when two broken people find exactly what they need in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather toolbox had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather. Jack Brenner ran his calloused fingers over the worn brass clasps, feeling the weight of 3 generations of honest work settling into his shoulders. The tools inside were old, but meticulously maintained, each chisel sharp, every screwdriver handle smooth from decades of use. His grandfather had built houses that still stood solid after 70 years. His father had crafted furniture that families passed down like heirlooms, and here was Jack, 34 years old, living in a rusted trailer that leaked every time the Pacific Northwest decided to remind him who was really in charge. The eviction notice lay crumpled on his makeshift kitchen table, a piece of paper that somehow weighed more than all his tools combined. 3 months behind on lot rent. The trailer park manager, Mrs. Kowalski, had been patient, more patient than he deserved, but patience didn't pay her bills any more than pride paid his. Jack stepped outside into the October morning, breathing in the sharp scent of pine and impending rain. The Cascade Mountains rose around him like ancient guardians, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. Beautiful country, if you could afford to appreciate beauty when your stomach was empty and your propane tank was running. On fumes, his pickup truck sat in the gravel driveway, rust eating through the wheel wells like some slow-moving cancer. The engine had been making that grinding noise for 2 weeks now, a sound that probably meant another repair bill he couldn't afford. But the truck was his lifeline. Without it, he couldn't get to the few jobs that still came his way. The work had dried up gradually, then all at once. First, the housing development that was supposed to employ him through winter had lost its financing. Then the furniture restoration shop where he picked up part-time work had closed when the owner's wife got sick. One by one, the steady jobs disappeared until he was left scraping together day labor and odd jobs that barely covered groceries, let alone rent. He'd tried the bigger construction companies in Seattle, but they wanted younger men, faster workers, people who could swing a hammer for 12 hours without their backs seizing up. Jack was still strong, still skilled, but at 34 he was already aging out of a young man's game. The irony wasn't lost on him. The older he got, the better he became at his craft, and the less anyone seemed to want that craft. Sarah would have known what to do. His wife had possessed a practical wisdom that could untangle any problem, find opportunity in the darkest corners. She'd been gone 3 years now, cancer taking her with the same methodical persistence that rust was taking his truck. Some days, the grief still hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest, but mostly now, it was a dull ache that he carried like an old injury. The community center in town had a bulletin board where people posted odd jobs: lawns to be mowed, gutters to be cleaned, the kind of work that paid cash and asked no questions. Jack drove there every morning, hoping to find something that would keep him afloat another day. The ritual had become as familiar as brushing his teeth and about as pleasant. But this morning was different. Among the usual postings for pet sitting, And house cleaning was something that made him stop and read twice. Handyman needed for remote cabin repair. Food and lodging provided. Extensive work required before winter. Serious inquiries only. GPS coordinates 47.72111N, 120.741W. Come prepared to work. No phone number, no name. Just coordinates that, when Jack plugged them into his phone, showed a location deep in the mountains about 2 hours north. The posting was handwritten on expensive paper, the kind with a subtle texture that whispered of money. The penmanship was precise, almost architectural in its clean lines. Jack studied the posting for a long time, aware that other people were moving around him, going about their morning business, while he contemplated what might be his last, best chance to avoid complete disaster. Food and lodging provided. That meant he wouldn't have to worry about groceries or the leak in his trailer roof. Extensive work meant steady employment, at least until winter set in properly. It also meant isolation, working for someone he'd never met, in a place he'd never been. The coordinates were remote enough that cell service would be spotty at best. If the job went wrong, if the person turned out to be unstable or dangerous, he'd be a long way from help. But the alternative was certain eviction, certain hunger, certain failure. Jack carefully copied the coordinates into his phone and drove. Home to pack. He didn't have much. A duffel bag of clothes, his tools, a few books Sarah had loved that he couldn't bear to part with. Everything that mattered to him fit easily in the bed of his truck. Mrs. Kowalski was waiting for him when he pulled into the trailer park. She was 70-something, Polish, and tougher than the nails Jack drove for a living. Her expression was a mixture of resignation and genuine sadness. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "Got a job up north, remote work. Might be gone a few weeks, maybe longer." She studied his face with eyes that had seen too much of life's hard truths. "Jack, I know things are difficult. If this job doesn't work out, it'll work out," he forced, conviction into his voice. "And when I get back, I'll have your money." Mrs. Kowalski nodded slowly. They both knew she'd rent his space to someone else within a week, but neither of them said it aloud. Some truths were too sharp to speak. The drive north took him through country that grew progressively wilder and more remote. First the suburbs of Seattle, then small logging towns, then just forest and mountain roads that twisted like question marks through stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar. His truck's engine complained on the steeper grades, but it held. Together, carrying him deeper into country where the trees grew so thick they blocked out most of the sky. The coordinates led him up a dirt road that hadn't seen grading in recent memory. Ruts and washouts forced him to creep along in first gear, rocks pinging off his undercarriage like angry insects. After 30 minutes of careful driving, the road opened into a small clearing dominated by a cabin that had seen better decades. The structure was solid, good bones, as his father would have said, but neglected. The roof sagged in places. Several windows were cracked or missing entirely, and the wraparound porch tilted like a ship taking on water. Moss grew thick on the north-facing walls, and blackberry vines had begun their patient campaign to reclaim the entire building. But underneath the neglect, Jack could see quality. Hand-hewn logs fitted with the precision that only came from master craftsmanship, mortise and tenon joints that would outlast the forest around them. Someone had built this place to last forever, and with the right care, it might just do that. Woman emerged from the cabin as Jack climbed out of his truck. She was perhaps 40, with shoulder-length brown hair, and the kind of careful composure that suggested she was used to being in control. Her clothes were simple, jeans and a flannel shirt, but something about the way she carried herself spoke of education, of a life lived in different circles than the ones Jack knew. "You must be here about the repair work," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jack couldn't place. "I'm Camille." Jack Brenner. He gestured toward the cabin. "That your posting at the community center?" It was. She studied him with intelligent eyes, taking in his work clothes, his calloused hands, the tool belt hanging from his waist. "What's your experience with log construction?" 20 years of carpentry, 5 of those specializing in restoration. Work. My father taught me traditional joinery. Jack approached the cabin's foundation, running his hand along one of the support posts. This is good work. Douglas fir? I believe so. The cabin was built in the 1940s by my grandfather. The slight hesitation suggested there was more to that story. It's been empty for several years. As you can see, it needs considerable attention. Jack walked the perimeter of the building, his trained eye cataloguing problems and solutions. The foundation was solid, but several sill plates would need replacing. The roof needed new shingles and flashing. Most of the windows required attention, and the entire structure needed chinking where the mortar between logs had cracked and fallen away. 6 weeks of work, he said finally. Maybe 8, depending on how much of the interior needs attention. The interior is livable. Barely, I'll show you. She led him through the front door into a space that spoke of faded grandeur. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by decades of use. The floors were wide plank Douglas fir, scuffed and scratched, but still beautiful. A kitchen occupied one corner, equipped with propane appliances that looked functional if not modern. There's running water from a well and a generator for electricity, Camille explained. The propane tank was filled last month. You're welcome to stay here while you work. What about payment? Jack asked the question carefully, aware that money talk could derail everything. Room and board while you're here, plus a fair wage for the work. We can discuss specific terms once you've had a chance to assess everything properly. It wasn't a direct answer, but something in her tone suggested that payment wouldn't be a problem, and room and board was what Jack needed most. A place to sleep and regular meals while he worked. I'll need to drive to town for supplies, he said. Of course, there's a hardware store in Clay Elm, about an hour south. They should have most of what you need. Jack looked around the cabin again, imagining what it could become with the right attention. Someone had loved this place once. Someone had built it to shelter generations of their family. It deserved better than slow decay. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow morning. Camille's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been relief. There's a bedroom upstairs that's clean and furnished. I'll be staying here as well, if that's acceptable. Your cabin, your rules. They spent the next hour going through the building room by room, Jack making notes about what needed attention while Camille provided what history she knew. The place had been in her family for 3 generations, she said, though she was vague about details. She'd inherited it recently and wanted to restore it before winter made the work impossible. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself studying his new employer as much as the building. There was something guarded about Camille, as if she were carefully controlling what she revealed. Her hands were soft, unmarked by manual labor, but she moved through the cabin with familiarity. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, where the light switches were located. Most intriguingly, she seemed genuinely interested in his work. When he explained how he'd repair the damaged sill plates, she asked intelligent questions about technique and materials. When he described the proper way to chink between logs, she listened with the attention of someone who actually cared about the answers. By evening, they'd established a working arrangement that satisfied them both. Jack would focus on exterior repairs first, taking advantage of the dry weather while it lasted. Camille would handle food and supplies, giving Jack one less thing to worry about. They'd share the space respectfully, 2 adults making the best of an unusual situation. That night, Jack lay in the upstairs bedroom, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. The mattress was comfortable, the room warm, and for the first time in months, he wasn't worried about where his next meal would come from. Below him, he could hear Camille moving quietly through the cabin, settling in for the night. He thought about Sarah, wondering what she would make of this strange arrangement. She'd always been better at reading people than he was, able to sense hidden currents and unspoken motivations. There was definitely something Camille wasn't telling him. But everyone had secrets. As long as she paid him fairly and let him do good work, her private business could remain private. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, its voice carrying all the patient wisdom of the deep woods. Jack smiled and closed his eyes, already planning tomorrow's work in his mind. For the first time in a long time, he had reason to look forward to morning. Jack woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming against the cabin windows. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself in the unfamiliar space, then smiled as he remembered where he was. A warm bed, a roof that didn't leak, and honest work waiting for him downstairs. It had been so long since he'd felt this particular brand of contentment that he'd almost forgotten what it was like. The smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen, accompanied by the soft sounds of someone moving, carefully trying not to wake others. Jack dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where he found Camille standing at the propane stove, tending a cast-iron skillet full of scrambled eggs. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind I'm an early riser. Makes two of us." Jack accepted the cup of coffee she offered, noting that it was good coffee, better than the instant stuff he'd been living on. "Rain's gonna make outdoor work interesting today. There's a covered workshop behind the cabin. Previous owner used it for woodworking, I think. You might be able to work on window frames out there, stay dry." Jack nodded, impressed again by her practical thinking. "You've given this some thought." "I've had time to think." She divided the eggs between two plates, adding toast that she'd somehow managed to make without a toaster. "I've been here alone for 2 weeks, watching this place fall apart a little. More each day." There was something wistful in her voice that made Jack study her more carefully. She moved through the kitchen with efficiency, but her clothes were expensive, the kind of casual wear that cost more than most people's work clothes. Her hands were soft, uncalloused, but she handled the cooking utensils with competence. "What brought you out here?" Jack asked, settling at the small kitchen table. "If you don't mind me asking." Camille hesitated, her back still turned to him. "Family obligations, and sometimes a person needs to get away from complications." It wasn't really an answer, but Jack recognized the tone of someone who didn't want to elaborate. He'd used that same careful deflection when people asked too many questions about Sarah, about how he'd ended up living in a trailer park despite his skills. They ate in comfortable silence, the rain providing a steady soundtrack against the windows. The eggs were perfectly seasoned, the toast golden brown. Jack couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him, and the simple pleasure of it caught him off guard. "I should warn you," Camille said as they finished eating. "My phone doesn't work up here. Yours probably won't either. If there's anyone you need to check in with, no one waiting to hear from me." The words came out more bitter than Jack intended. He softened his tone. "What about you? People will wonder where you are." Something flickered across Camille's face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I left word that I'd be away for a while. Sometimes the best way to handle complications is to step away from them completely." She stood abruptly and began clearing the dishes, her movements sharp and efficient. Jack sensed he'd touched on something painful, so he let the subject drop and headed outside to examine the workshop she'd mentioned. The rain had settled into the steady, determined pattern that could last for days in this part of the world. Jack pulled up his jacket collar and jogged across the muddy yard to a small building that stood partially hidden behind a screen of fir trees. The workshop was better than he'd dared hope. Someone had invested serious money in this space. A proper workbench, good lighting, even a small wood stove for heat. Tools hung neatly on pegboard walls, and though they were old, they'd been maintained with obvious care. A table saw dominated. One corner, its surface covered but clearly functional. Jack spent the morning taking inventory and planning his approach to the work. The window frames could indeed be repaired inside, away from the weather. He could cut new trim pieces on the table saw, work on the more delicate joinery in comfort. It would actually be more efficient than working outside. Around noon, Camille appeared in the workshop doorway carrying a thermos and 2 cups. "Thought you might want something warm," she said, stepping carefully around the tools Jack had laid out. "Appreciated." Jack accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich smell of what turned out to be excellent hot chocolate. This workshop is incredible. Whoever set it up knew what they were doing. My grandfather was a carpenter before he got into other work. Camille ran her fingers along the workbench surface, worn smooth by decades of use. He built most of this place with his own hands. What kind of other work? Again, that hesitation. Business, import-export, I think. He traveled a lot. Jack nodded, though something about her answer felt rehearsed. People's stories about their families usually contained more detail, more emotion. But he was hardly in a position to judge. His own family history had enough painful gaps that he avoided discussing. They worked together for the next hour, Camille holding pieces while Jack measured and marked cuts. She had good hands for the work, steady and precise, and she followed instructions without needing them repeated. More than once, Jack found himself thinking that she'd probably been good at whatever her regular job was. "Can I ask you something?" Camille said as Jack lined up a cut on the table saw. "Shoot. Do you ever wonder if you're living the life you're supposed to be living?" The question was so unexpected that Jack paused, with his hand on the saw's power switch. "That's a hell of a thing to ask someone. I'm sorry. I don't usually. I spend too much time alone, I think. Start asking the big questions out loud." Jack made his cut, the saw blade singing through the cedar trim piece. "I used to think I had it figured out," he said when the noise stopped. "Married young, started my business, thought I'd build something lasting. Then life happened." "Your wife?" "Cancer. 3 years ago." The words still felt like swallowing. "Glass. After that, it seemed like everything I'd built just unraveled." Camille was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. Changed everything. Made me realize how little control we actually have." Jack picked up the freshly cut piece, examining it for squareness. "What about you? Having second thoughts about your choices? More like wondering if I ever really made any choices at all. Sometimes it feels like life just carries you along, and you wake up one day in a place you never intended to be." There was something raw in her voice that made Jack look up from his work. Camille was staring out the workshop window at the rain-soaked forest, her expression distant and troubled. "You can always make different choices," Jack said gently. "Might not be easy, but the option's always there." "Is it? What if the life you're living affects other people? What if walking away would hurt them? Then you have to decide what you can live with. Sometimes staying hurts people too, just in different ways." They worked in thoughtful silence after that, the conversation settling between them like dust. Jack found himself stealing glances at Camille, trying to read the story, written in her careful posture and guarded expressions. She was running from something, that much was clear. The question was whether she was running towards something better or just away from something worse. Late in the afternoon, as Jack was cleaning up his work area, Camille's phone buzzed. She'd placed it on the workbench, and when the screen lit up, Jack couldn't help but notice that it was an expensive model, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month. The screen showed several missed calls and a string of text messages. Camille glanced at the phone, and her entire demeanor changed. The color drained from her face and her hands began to shake slightly. "Everything okay?" Jack asked. "Fine. Just work stuff." She picked up the phone and powered it off completely, her movements jerky and decisive. "I told you, sometimes you have to step away from complications." But she didn't look fine. She looked like someone who'd just received very bad news or been reminded of something she'd been trying to forget. Jack wanted to ask more questions, but something in her expression warned him off. That evening, they shared dinner in a silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet of the morning. Camille cooked another excellent meal, pasta with a sauce that tasted homemade, bread that definitely hadn't come from a store, but she barely touched her own food, instead pushing it around her plate while staring into the fire Jack had built in the stone fireplace. "Camille," Jack said finally, "I don't know what kind of trouble you're dealing with, but if there's anything I can do to help..." She looked up sharply, and for a moment Jack saw something vulnerable and frightened in her eyes, before she shuttered them again. "You're helping more than you know," she said quietly, "just by being here, treating me like a normal person. I haven't had that in a long time." "What do you mean, normal person?" "Someone who doesn't want anything from me. Someone who isn't trying to use me or manipulate me or convince me to do things I don't want to do." She managed a small smile. "Someone who judges me by whether I can hold a board steady while you cut it, not by other things." Jack wanted to ask what other things, but Camille had already turned back to the fire, effectively ending the conversation. He studied her profile in the flickering light, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone expecting an attack. Whatever complications she was running from, they were serious. And despite her claims about wanting to be treated normally, nothing about Camille struck Jack as normal. The expensive clothes disguised as casual wear, the perfect cooking skills, the way she sometimes spoke as if she were used to giving orders rather than taking them, it all added up to someone playing a role, pretending to be something she wasn't. But then again, wasn't everyone pretending to some degree? Jack was certainly presenting himself as a competent handyman with his life together, when the truth was that he was one bad week away from sleeping in his truck. Everyone had masks they wore, stories they told themselves, and others to make sense of their circumstances. As they prepared for bed, Camille paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Jack, thank you for not pushing, for not asking too many questions, for just letting me be whoever I am right now. We all deserve that courtesy." Jack replied, "Whatever brought you here, it's your business. I'm just grateful for the work." But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the rain continue its assault on the cabin roof, Jack found himself wondering what kind of life someone had to be living to consider hiding in a remote mountain cabin a refuge. And why, despite all the warning signs that Camille was trouble he couldn't afford, he found himself hoping she'd stay long enough for him to find out. The photograph was old, its edges softened by handling and time. Jack glimpsed it when Camille's wallet fell open as she reached for her coffee cup the next morning. A family of 4 stood in front of a modest house, a man in work clothes, a woman in a simple dress, and 2 young girls squinting against bright sunlight. One of the girls had Camille's eyes. "Sorry," Camille said quickly, snapping the wallet shut. But not before Jack noticed that everything else inside looked expensive. Credit cards with metallic finishes, what appeared to be a driver's license from California. "Family?" Jack asked, keeping his tone casual as he sipped his coffee. "My parents and sister. A long time ago." Camille's voice carried a weight that suggested the distance was measured in more than just years. "Before things got complicated." Jack nodded and let the subject drop. But the photograph stayed with him as he worked that morning. The house in the picture had looked like the kind of place where people worked hard for everything they had. Not unlike the neighborhood where Jack had grown up. It didn't match the expensive phone, the quality of Camille's clothes, or the way she sometimes spoke as if she were used to people following her instructions. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine needles. Jack spent the morning replacing rotten sections of the cabin's wraparound porch, while Camille worked inside, cleaning and organizing with the focused intensity of someone who needed to keep busy. Around noon, she appeared beside him carrying a lunch that looked like it belonged in a restaurant, sandwiches cut diagonally on artisanal bread, soup in a thermos that probably cost more than Jack's tool belt. "You don't have to wait on me," Jack said, accepting the meal gratefully. "I can make my own lunch. I like cooking. It's therapeutic." Camille settled beside him on the porch steps, unwrapping her own sandwich. "Besides, you're working hard. It's the least I can do." They ate in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle overhead while chipmunks chattered in the trees around them. Jack found himself studying Camille's profile, noting the way she seemed to really see the forest around them, as if she were memorizing details she might need later. "How long since you've been up here?" he asked. Years, maybe 10 years. She paused, seeming to calculate. I used to come here as a child sometimes, but after my grandfather died, the family sort of scattered. What kind of business was your grandfather in? You mentioned import-export. Various things. He was the kind of man who saw opportunities, where other people saw problems. Camille's smile was fond but distant. He always said the secret to success was understanding what people really needed, not just what they thought they wanted. Sounds like a wise man? He was. He's the one who taught me that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones nobody else understands. There was something in her tone that suggested she was talking about more than her grandfather's business. Philosophy. Jack wanted to ask what decision she was struggling with, but Camille had already stood up, brushing crumbs from her jeans. I should let you get back to work, she said. I want to tackle the kitchen this afternoon. Some of those cabinets haven't been cleaned in a decade. Jack watched her disappear into the cabin, then returned to his work on the porch. The rhythm of physical labor had always helped him think, and as he measured and cut new boards, he found himself trying to piece together the puzzle that was Camille. She cooked like someone who'd had training, not just good home cooking, but technique that spoke of professional instruction. She moved through the world with the confidence of someone used to being in charge, but she deferred to him completely when it came to the cabin repairs. Most tellingly, she seemed genuinely surprised when he treated her opinions as important, as if she were used to being ignored or dismissed. The afternoon passed quickly, Jack lost in the satisfaction of good work. He was replacing the last section of damaged porch railing when he heard voices from inside the cabin, Camille's voice and a man's voice he didn't recognize. Jack set down his tools and moved quietly toward the front door, not wanting to eavesdrop, but concerned for Camille's safety. Through the screen door, he could see her standing in the living room, her back rigid with tension, speaking to someone Jack couldn't see. You can't just disappear, Camille. People are starting to ask questions. Let them ask. I told you I needed time. Time for what? To play house in the wilderness? This isn't like you. Maybe that's the point. Camille's voice was sharp with anger. Maybe I'm tired of being like me. Jack heard footsteps moving toward the door and quickly returned to his work, pretending to be absorbed in measuring a board. A moment later, a man in an expensive suit emerged from the cabin, his face set in frustration. He was younger than Jack, maybe early 30s, with the kind of aggressive handsomeness that belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. The man stopped when he saw Jack, his expression shifting to something calculating and dismissive. You must be the handyman. That's right. Jack straightened, meeting the man's gaze steadily. Something I can help you with? Just leaving. The man's smile was cold. Take care of yourself up here. These mountains can be dangerous for people who don't belong. He walked to a black SUV that Jack hadn't heard arrive, its engine so quiet it might as well have been electric. The vehicle looked expensive and out of place on the rough mountain road, like a piece of expensive jewelry dropped in a construction site. Camille appeared in the doorway as the SUV disappeared down the dirt track, her face pale and drawn. Everything okay? Jack asked. Fine, just business. She wrapped her arms around herself despite the warm afternoon. Someone who doesn't understand the concept of taking time off seemed pretty insistent. Some people think they own other people's time. Camille's laugh was bitter. They're usually wrong. Jack wanted to ask more questions, but Camille had already turned and gone back inside. Through the windows, he could see her moving restlessly through the cabin, straightening things that were already straight, organizing spaces that were already organized. That evening, she cooked dinner with the same focused intensity she'd shown. All day, preparing what was easily the best meal Jack had eaten in months. Herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables that actually tasted like vegetables, bread that was somehow both crispy and soft. It was the kind of food that belonged in expensive restaurants, not rustic mountain cabins. Where did you learn to cook like this? Jack asked as they settled by the fireplace after dinner, My mother, initially, then professional training. Camille stared into the flames. I used to think cooking was a waste of time, something other people did while I focused on more important things. Turns out I had that backwards. What kind of more important things? The kind that seemed important at the time, but don't matter at all when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering how you became someone you don't recognize. Jack studied her profile in the firelight, noting the sadness that seemed to settle around her like a familiar coat. Want to talk about it? Not really. But thank you for asking. She turned to look at him, and her smile was genuine, despite the sadness in her eyes. It's been a long time since someone asked what I wanted to talk about, instead of telling me what I needed to hear. What's the difference? Control. When someone asks what you want to talk about, they're giving you the choice. When they tell you what you need to hear, they're taking it away. Jack nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. Sarah used to say that the most generous thing you could give someone was the space to be themselves without judgment. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Probably too good for me, if I'm being honest. I doubt that. Camille's voice was soft. You're one of the kindest men I've ever met, Jack. The way you've treated me these past few days, like I'm just a person instead of whatever people usually see when they look at me. What do people usually see? Camille was quiet for so long that Jack thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. An opportunity. A problem to be solved. An asset to be managed. She looked at him directly. You see someone who might be worth knowing. That's rarer than you might think. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Jack found himself thinking about the man in the expensive suit, about the way he'd looked at Jack like he was an obstacle to be removed, about the fear he'd seen in Camille's eyes and the way she seemed to be hiding from something much larger than personal problems. When they finally said goodnight and headed upstairs, Camille paused at her bedroom door. Jack? That man who came. By today, if he comes back or if anyone else shows up asking about me, I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell them anything. What kind of anything? Anything at all, please. The fear in her voice was real, and it made something protective stir in Jack's chest. Whatever Camille was running from, it was serious enough to make her afraid of discovery. Your business is your business, he said. Far as I'm concerned, you're just someone who hired me to fix her cabin. The relief that crossed her face was so profound that Jack realized she'd been genuinely afraid he might refuse. What kind of life had she been living that a simple promise of discretion felt like a major victory? Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what that means to me. But as Jack lay in bed that night, he wondered if he was getting himself into something more complicated than he could handle. Camille was clearly more than she appeared to be, and people in expensive suits didn't drive hours into the mountains to discuss ordinary business matters. Still, when he thought about the photograph in her wallet, the young girl with Camille's eyes standing in front of a modest house, he found himself hoping that whatever complications surrounded her now, she'd find her way back to something that simple and real. Jack still wore his wedding ring. 3 years after Sarah's death, the thin gold band remained on his left hand, a talisman against a world that had proven itself capable of taking away everything that mattered. He'd thought about removing it countless times, but something always stopped him. Superstition, maybe, or the fear that taking it off would be admitting that the best part of his life was truly over. He was thinking about the ring as he worked. On the cabin's window frames, sanding away years of weather damage, while Camille organized the kitchen cabinets with the methodical precision of someone who needed to keep her hands busy. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past few days, working in parallel while maintaining the comfortable distance of two people who respected each other's need for space. But something had shifted after the visit from the man in the expensive suit. Camille seemed more present somehow, more invested in their daily interactions. She asked more questions about his work, shared more details about the cabin's history, and seemed genuinely interested in learning basic repair techniques. "Show me how to do that," she said, appearing beside him as he worked on a particularly stubborn window sash that had swollen with moisture over the years. "It's not complicated, but it takes patience." Jack handed her a piece of sandpaper. "You have to work with the wood's grain, not against it. Like this." He guided her hands, showing her the proper angle and pressure. Her skin was soft but not helpless. She had good instincts for the work, and she listened carefully to his instructions. When she got the technique right, her smile was bright with genuine accomplishment. "I've never built anything with my hands before," she said, examining the smoothed wood with satisfaction. "I mean, never anything real." "What did you do before? For work?" Camille's expression tightened slightly. "Management, strategic planning. The kind of work where you move numbers around on screens and call it productivity." Sounds like it paid. "Well, it did. Too well, maybe." She returned to sanding, her movements becoming more aggressive. "Ever wonder if getting paid a lot for something is a sign that it's probably not worth doing?" Jack considered this while working on another section of the frame. "Depends on whether the work makes the world better or worse, I guess. And if you can't tell the difference, then maybe it's time to find different work." They worked in comfortable silence after that, the rhythm of sanding providing a meditative backdrop to Jack's thoughts. He found himself stealing glances at Camille, noting the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the small sound of satisfaction she made when she got the technique just right. Around midday, Jack's back began to seize up, an old injury from his construction days that flared up when he spent too long bent over detailed work. He straightened with a grimace, pressing his hand to the spot just above his left hip where the muscles had locked into a knot. "You okay?" Camille was at his side immediately, her face creased with concern. "Just an old injury. Happens sometimes. When I overdo it." Jack tried to stretch, but the movement sent a sharp spike of pain down his leg. "I'll be fine in a minute." "Sit down." It wasn't a request. Camille guided him to a chair in the kitchen, then disappeared upstairs. She returned a moment later with a small bottle of what looked like expensive massage oil and a heating pad that must have come from her car. "I'm not an invalid," Jack protested, but Camille was already plugging in the heating pad. "No, but you're hurt, and I know something about muscle injuries." She warmed some of the oil between her palms. "May I?" Jack hesitated. It had been years since anyone had touched him with care, since anyone had offered comfort instead of just sympathy. The intimacy of it felt both wonderful and terrifying. "It's just a muscle spasm," Camille said gently, reading his hesitation. "I'm not trying to seduce you, though if I were, I'd probably choose a more romantic setting than a half-renovated kitchen." Despite the pain, Jack laughed. "Okay, but if you make it worse, then you can fire me from my job as your unpaid assistant." Camille's hands were strong and sure as she worked on the knotted muscles, finding the source of the problem with the precision of someone who'd had professional training. The oil smelled of eucalyptus and something else Jack couldn't identify, something that reminded him of expensive spas he'd never visited. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, trying to ignore how good her hands felt on his skin. "Physical therapy training. I had some issues with stress-related injuries a few years ago. Learned massage techniques as part of my recovery." "What kind of stress causes injuries?" Camille's hands paused for a moment. "The kind that comes from forgetting you're human instead of just a machine that processes information and makes decisions." Jack thought about that as she continued working on his back. The knot was beginning to loosen, the sharp pain fading to a dull ache. But more than the physical relief, he was struck by the gentleness of her touch, the careful attention she paid. To his comfort. "Better?" she asked after several minutes. "Much, thank you." Jack turned to face her, suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, how her eyes seemed to catch and hold the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. "Jack," Camille said softly, and something in her voice made his breath catch. For a moment, The air between them felt charged with possibility. Jack could see his own feelings reflected in her expression, the growing attraction, the careful hope, the fear of moving too fast or assuming too much. He leaned slightly toward her, and she didn't pull away. Then Camille's phone buzzed from where she'd left it on the counter, and the spell broke. She jerked back as if she'd been burned, her face flushing with what might have been embarrassment. Or panic. "I should check that," she said, though she made no move toward the phone. "Camille, this is complicated, Jack." She stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "More complicated than you know. Most good things are complicated. Not like this." She finally looked at her phone, and whatever she saw there made her face go pale. "I need to make a call. Would you mind giving me some privacy?" Jack nodded, though he was reluctant to leave. Something about Camille's expression reminded him of a trapped animal looking for an escape route. He spent the next hour working outside, replacing damaged shingles on the cabin's south-facing slope, while trying not to think about the way Camille's hands had felt on his skin, or the moment when she'd looked at him like he might be worth the risk of letting someone close. Through the cabin windows, he could hear her voice, though not her words. The conversation went on for a long time, and her tone grew increasingly sharp and frustrated. Once, he heard what sounded like crying, though when he glanced through the window, Camille had her back turned to him. When she finally emerged from the cabin, her composure was firmly back in place, but Jack could see the strain around her eyes. "Everything okay? Just work issues. Nothing I can't handle." But her voice lacked conviction, and she kept glancing at her phone as if expecting it to ring again. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, but the easy intimacy from earlier was gone, replaced by a careful politeness that felt like armor. Camille answered his questions about the cabin's history, but she volunteered nothing about herself, and she avoided meeting his eyes directly. That evening, she cooked dinner with the same skill as always, but she barely touched her own food. Jack wanted to ask what was wrong, wanted to push past her careful barriers and find out what had frightened her so badly. But he also remembered what she'd said about people who told her what she needed to hear, instead of asking what she wanted to talk about. "The work's going well," he said instead, keeping his tone neutral. "Another week and I should have most of the exterior repairs finished. And then, interior work, if you want it done. Some of the floorboards need attention, and the upstairs bathroom could use updating. How long would that take?" Jack studied her face, trying to read the emotion beneath her careful expression. "Depends on how much you want done. Could be another month, maybe longer." Something flickered in Camille's eyes. Relief, maybe, or hope. "I'd like that. The interior work, I mean. This place deserves to be properly restored." "It does. Someone put a lot of love into building it." "Yes," Camille said quietly, looking around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. "Someone did." Later that evening, as they sat by the fire reading, Jack with a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright he'd found on the cabin's shelves, Camille with what looked like a business journal, Jack found himself thinking about the moment in the kitchen when she'd touched him with such careful tenderness. Sarah had touched him like that, with hands that offered comfort without asking for anything in return. He'd thought he'd never find that again, had convinced himself he didn't deserve it. But this afternoon, for just a few minutes, he'd felt like someone worth caring for. The problem was that Camille was clearly fighting her own battles, dealing with complications that went far beyond a simple desire for solitude. Whatever had happened during that phone call had shaken her badly, and Jack could see her withdrawing into herself, like a turtle pulling back into its shell. When they said good night and headed upstairs, Camille paused at her bedroom door. "Jack, this afternoon when we were close, I want you to know it wasn't just gratitude or loneliness or anything like that. I know, I care about you, more than I should, considering." "Considering what?" But Camille just shook her head. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's supposed to be clear. Good weather for working on the roof." Jack lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the sounds of the forest and thinking about the careful way Camille had said she cared about him more than she should. What kind of life was she living that caring for someone felt like? A luxury she couldn't afford. He thought about his wedding ring, still circling his finger like a golden reminder of love lost. Maybe it was time to consider the possibility that love could be found again, even in the most unexpected places. Maybe it was time to stop protecting himself from the possibility of loss and start opening himself to the possibility of gain. But first, he needed to understand what Camille was so afraid of, and why she seemed to think that caring for him was somehow dangerous for them both. The magazine had been used as kindling, its glossy pages crumpled and stuffed beneath the logs in the fireplace. Jack might never have noticed it if he hadn't needed to rebuild the fire that morning while Camille slept in. As he arranged the wood, a familiar face caught his eye from among the twisted pages, a professional headshot of a woman who looked remarkably like Camille, but dressed in an expensive suit, with her hair styled in a way that spoke of corporate boardrooms and power. Lunches? Jack carefully extracted the page, smoothing it out on the kitchen table. The headline read, "Tech visionary Camille Drake takes indefinite leave from Drake Industries." The article was dated 3 weeks ago, and the woman in the photograph was definitely his Camille, though she looked like a completely different person. Harder, more polished, wearing the kind of expression that suggested she was used to making decisions that affected thousands of people. He read the article twice, his coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. Camille Drake, CEO and founder of Drake Industries, one of the fastest-growing tech companies on the West Coast. Net worth estimated in the hundreds of millions. The article mentioned a personal leave of absence and speculation about health issues, family problems, or possible board conflicts. Jack set the magazine page aside and stared out the kitchen window at the forest beyond, trying to reconcile the woman in the photograph with the person who'd taught him to make perfect scrambled eggs, who'd massaged his aching back with such gentle care, who'd looked at him like he was someone worth knowing. No wonder she'd seemed familiar with giving orders. No wonder her clothes were expensive, her phone top of the line, her cooking skills professionally trained. No wonder someone had driven hours into the mountains to argue with her about disappearing. The question was, what did it mean for him? Jack was still mulling this over when Camille appeared in the kitchen, her hair tousled from sleep, wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Jack made in a month. "Morning," she said, moving toward the coffee maker with the efficiency of someone who couldn't function without caffeine. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." Jack watched her face carefully. Had some interesting reading material. He slid the magazine page across the table. Camille glanced at it, and every trace of color drained from her face. "Where did you find this?" "Fireplace. Someone was using it for kindling." Camille sank into the chair across from him, staring at her own image, as if she were looking at a stranger. "I suppose this changes things. Does it? Doesn't it?" She looked up at him, and Jack could see fear in her eyes. "Now you know who I really am, do I? Because the woman in this picture looks like someone I've never met." "That's because you haven't. That woman is everything I'm trying to get away from." Jack studied the photograph again, noting the cold confidence in Camille's expression, the way she held herself like someone who'd never doubted her right to be in charge. "Tell me about her," he said quietly. Camille was silent for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of the magazine page. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She's ambitious, brilliant probably, absolutely ruthless. When she needs to be, she built a company from nothing and turned it into something worth billions." Camille's laugh was bitter. "She's also completely miserable and hasn't had a genuine human connection in years." "What happened to her?" "Success, I suppose. The kind that eats everything else in your life until there's nothing left but work and wealth and the constant pressure to achieve more." Camille looked out the window at the forest. "Do you know what it's like to have everything you thought you wanted and realize it's not enough? To be surrounded by people who need things from you, but don't actually see you as a person. Jack thought about his own struggles, about the months of watching his savings disappear and his prospects dwindle. I know what it's like to have nothing, and think that more would solve everything. Maybe that's why this works. Camille gestured between them. You don't need anything from me except honest work and fair payment. You see Camille the person, not Camille the CEO. Is that who you want to be? Just Camille the person? I don't know anymore. I've been playing the CEO role for so long that I'm not sure where the performance ends and the real person begins. Jack reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The woman who taught me to make breakfast, who learned to sand wood just because she was curious, that's real. The woman who took care of my back when it was hurting, who listens when I talk about Sarah, that's real too. Camille turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. What if the rest of it is too complicated? What if being with me means dealing with reporters and lawyers and board meetings and people who think they have a right to an opinion about your life? What if it doesn't? Jack, you don't understand. There are probably private investigators looking for me right now. My company is worth billions of dollars, and I can't just walk away without consequences. The board, the shareholders, the employees, they all have expectations. What do you have expectations for? The question seemed to catch Camille off guard. She stared at him for a moment, as if no one had ever asked her what she wanted for herself. I want to wake up in the morning without feeling like I'm about to go into battle, she said finally. I want to have conversations that aren't about market share or quarterly projections or hostile takeover attempts. I want to touch something I built with my own hands and know that it will still be there tomorrow, not because it's profitable, but because it matters. Those sound like reasonable expectations, do they? Because I'm starting to think they're incompatible with the life I've built. Before Jack could respond, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Through the kitchen window, they could see two black SUVs making their careful way up the rutted track, moving with the determined precision of people who had business to conduct. Camille's hand tightened on Jack's. They found me. Who? My life. She stood abruptly, moving away from the window. The part I was trying to leave behind. The vehicle stopped in the clearing beside Jack's truck, and 4 people emerged, 2 men in expensive suits, a woman who looked like she could be a lawyer, and another woman who carried herself with the authority of someone used to being in charge. They surveyed the cabin and its surroundings with the critical eye of people evaluating an investment property. Ms. Drake, the lead man called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. We need to speak with you. Camille closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with defeat. I have to deal with this. You don't have to deal with anything, Jack said, standing beside her. This is private property. You can tell them to leave. It's not that simple. These people, they represent obligations I can't just ignore. What kind of obligations? The kind that come with being responsible for 10,000 jobs and billions of dollars in shareholder value. Camille straightened, and Jack could see her putting on armor, transforming back into the woman from the magazine photograph. The kind that don't care about personal happiness or individual choice. She moved toward the door, but Jack caught her arm gently. You don't have to be that person here. You don't have to be that person with me. I know. That's what makes this so hard. Camille opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Jack following close behind. The 4 visitors approached with the synchronized movement of people who'd worked together before, their expressions professional and impatient. Ms. Drake, the lead man said. I'm David Torino, legal counsel for Drake Industries. We've been trying to reach you for over a week. I'm on personal leave, David. I thought I made that clear. The board is concerned about your extended absence. There are decisions that require your approval, contracts that need your signature. Then the board can make those decisions themselves. That's what I pay them for. The woman who looked like a lawyer stepped forward. Ms. Drake, with respect, your personal leave is creating significant liability issues for the company. The stock price has dropped 12% since news of your absence became public." Jack watched this exchange with growing understanding. These people weren't just employees. They were predators, circling wounded prey, using corporate responsibility as a weapon to force Camille back into a role she was desperately trying to escape. "Camille," he said quietly, "you don't owe them an explanation." All four visitors turned to look at Jack as if they'd just noticed his existence. Their expressions ranged from dismissive to openly hostile. "And you are?" Torino asked, his tone suggesting that whatever Jack was, it wasn't important. Someone who thinks people have a right to privacy on their own property. "This is a private conversation," the lawyer said sharply. "Perhaps you could give us some space." "This is my job site," Jack replied evenly. "I'm not going anywhere." He saw something flicker in Camille's eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or surprise, that someone was willing to stand up to these people on her behalf. She straightened slightly, some of her corporate armor falling away. "Mr. Brenner is right," she said. "This is private property, and I'm under no obligation to discuss company business here." "Ms. Drake," Torino's voice took on a threatening edge, "I don't think you understand the seriousness of the situation. There are rumors of a hostile takeover attempt, questions about your mental health, speculation that you might be involved in some kind of scandal. Your continued absence is only feeding those rumors. Then perhaps the company should have better crisis management. The company needs its CEO. The company needs leadership. It doesn't necessarily need me." The silence that followed this statement was loaded with implications. Jack could see the visitors exchanging glances, recalculating their approach. "We'll be staying at the lodge in Clealum," Torino said finally. "We'll expect to hear from you within 24 hours. This situation cannot continue indefinitely." They returned to their vehicles and drove away, leaving Camille and Jack standing on the porch in the sudden quiet of the forest. "That went well," Camille said dryly. "They can't force you to go back, can't they? You heard them. 10,000. Jobs, shareholder value, fiduciary responsibility. When you build something that big, it stops belonging to just you." Jack thought about his father's toolbox, about the generations of craftsmen who'd built things meant to last. Maybe the question isn't whether you can walk away. Maybe it's whether walking away is the same thing as running away. Camille looked at him sharply. "What's the difference? When you're walking away, you're moving towards something better. When you're running away, you're just trying to escape something worse. And which one am I doing?" Jack looked at her. Really looked at her, seeing both the frightened woman who'd been hiding in the mountains and the powerful executive who'd built an empire from nothing. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're trying to figure out who you want to be when you grow up, even though you're already grown up, despite everything." Camille smiled. "That might be the most insightful thing anyone said to me in years." "What do you want to do?" "I want to finish fixing this cabin with you. I want to learn how to build something that lasts. And I want to figure out if there's a way to be both successful and happy, instead of having to choose one or the other." "Those sound like good goals, do they? Because right now they feel impossible." Jack reached for her hand, noting that she didn't pull away. "Most good things feel impossible until you start working on them." "Is that your professional opinion, Mr. Brenner?" "That's my personal opinion, Ms. Drake." But even as they stood there, holding hands, Jack could see the shadow of doubt in Camille's eyes, the fear that her past was too powerful to escape and her future too uncertain to trust. The wine bottle appeared at dinner 3 nights later, as if Camille had been saving it for a special occasion. Jack recognized it as expensive even before he read the label, a 1995 Bordeaux that probably cost more than his monthly rent back. When he'd had rent to pay, she opened it with the practiced ease of someone who'd attended enough corporate dinners to know good wine from great wine. "Celebrating something?" Jack asked, accepting the glass she offered. "Surviving something." Camille raised her glass in a mock toast. 3 days without my phone ringing, without lawyers appearing at the door, without anyone telling me what I'm supposed to do with my life. Jack tasted the wine, which was indeed extraordinary, rich and complex in a way that made him understand why people paid fortunes for bottles like this. Where does someone learn about wine like this? Client dinners, board meetings, the kind of social obligations that come with running a company. Camille settled across from him at the small kitchen table, which she'd set with actual cloth napkins and candles. I used to think it was sophisticated. Now I realize it was just expensive. What's the difference? Sophistication is about appreciation. Expense is about exclusion. She gestured around the simple cabin kitchen. This meal, fish we caught ourselves, vegetables from the garden we're restoring, wine we're sharing because we want to, not because we have to. This is sophisticated. Jack looked at the dinner she'd prepared. They'd spent the afternoon fishing in the lake below the cabin, and Camille had surprised him by knowing how to clean and prepare the trout they'd caught. The vegetables had indeed come from the overgrown garden behind the cabin, which they'd been slowly reclaiming from the blackberry vines and weeds. "You're full of surprises," he said. "Good surprises or bad surprises?" "Good ones. Mostly." Jack paused, then decided to ask the question that had been nagging at him. "Camille, can I ask you something directly?" "Always. What are you afraid of?" She was quiet for a long time, swirling the wine in her glass while she considered his question. Outside, the evening light was fading, and the first stars were becoming visible through the kitchen window. "I'm afraid that if I go back to my old life, I'll lose myself completely," she said finally. "But I'm also afraid that if I don't go back, I'll be responsible for destroying something that a lot of people depend on. And what about what you depend on?" "That's just it. I don't know what I depend on anymore. For so long, my identity was tied up in being successful, being in control, being the person who had all the answers. Take that away, and I'm not sure who I am." Jack studied her face in the candlelight, noting the vulnerability she was allowing him to see. "Who do you want to be? Someone who builds things instead of just managing them. Someone who has time for conversations that matter. Someone who—" She trailed off, looking directly at him. "Someone who can care about another person without calculating the strategic implications." The air between them suddenly felt charged with possibility. Jack reached across the table and took her hand, noting how naturally their fingers intertwined. "You don't have to calculate anything with me," he said quietly. "Don't I? Jack, you have no idea what my world is like. There are reporters who would pay 6 figures for photographs of us together. There are competitors who would use our relationship to attack my credibility. There are board members who would argue that my personal life makes me unfit for leadership. So, what? Let them argue. It's not that simple. When you're in my position, your personal life becomes everyone else's business. Privacy becomes a luxury you can't afford." Jack thought about this while he sipped his wine. "What if you changed your position?" "You mean quit?" "I mean choose. Choose what matters most to you, and build your life around that, instead of trying to fit your life into a position someone else created." Camille laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You make it sound easy." "I didn't say it would be easy. I said it would be a choice." They finished dinner in thoughtful silence, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling between them like evening fog. When Camille suggested they take their wine outside to watch the stars, Jack followed her onto the porch they'd been steadily repairing over the past weeks. The night was clear and cold, the kind of mountain evening that made the stars look close, enough to touch. They settled into the wooden chairs Jack had restored, sharing a blanket and the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd learned to appreciate each other's company. "Jack," Camille said softly, "I need to tell you something." "Okay, I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the night air between them, simple and profound. Jack felt his heart skip, then begin beating faster. "That scares you," he said. "Terrifies me. Because I don't know how to love someone without destroying them. Everyone who gets close to me becomes a target, a weakness that can be exploited. I don't want that to happen to you." Jack turned in his chair to face her fully. "What if I'm willing to take that risk? You don't understand what you're risking. Then explain it to me." Camille was quiet for a long moment, her face pale in the starlight. "There are people who would see our relationship as an opportunity to manipulate me, others who would see it as evidence that I'm not committed to my company, and some who would see it as a way to get to information or influence that could be worth millions. And what do you see it as?" "The first honest thing I've felt in years." Jack reached for her hand, pulling her closer until they were sharing the same chair, her body warm against his in the cold night air. "Camille, I can't promise that I understand your world or that I'll always know how to handle the complications that come with it. But I can promise that what I feel for you has nothing to do with your money or your company or your position." "What does it have to do with?" "The way you listen when I talk about Sarah. The way you learned to sand wood just because you were curious. The way you take care of me when I'm hurt. And the way you let me take care of you." Jack paused, gathering courage. "I'm falling in love with you too." Camille turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Jack, I've never had anyone say they loved me without wanting something in return. I'm not asking for anything in return, aren't you? What about the future? What about building a life together? What about all the normal things that people in love want? I want those things, but I want them with you, not with your bank account or your company. If you walked away from all of it tomorrow and we had to live in my old trailer, I'd be the luckiest man alive. You say that now, but you don't know what it would really mean. The media attention, the loss of privacy, the constant pressure." Jack silenced her with a kiss. Soft and gentle and full of everything he couldn't put into words. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I know what I'm choosing," he said. "The question is what you're choosing." Camille studied his face for a long moment, then kissed him back with a passion that answered every question he'd been afraid to ask. When they finally separated, she rested her forehead against his. "I choose you," she whispered. "Whatever that means. Whatever it costs, I choose you." They made love that night with the desperate tenderness of two people who'd found something precious and weren't sure they'd be allowed to keep it. Afterward, they lay in Camille's bed, listening to the wind in the trees outside, their bodies intertwined and their futures suddenly impossibly connected. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin. "I don't know, but for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to finding out." They talked until dawn, sharing stories about their pasts, their fears, their dreams for a future that felt both impossible and inevitable. Camille told him about the loneliness of success, about board meetings where she was the only woman, about the pressure of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Jack told her about the months after Sarah's death, about the slow dissolution of everything he'd thought he could count on, about the fear that he'd never again be someone worth loving. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they made plans that felt like promises. They would finish restoring the cabin together. Camille would figure out a way to handle her company obligations without sacrificing her personal happiness. Jack would help her build something real and lasting, something that belonged to them, rather than to shareholders or board members or anyone else who thought they had a claim on their lives. But even as they planned and promised and hoped, Jack could see the worry in Camille's eyes, the fear that the world they were trying to leave behind wouldn't let them go so easily. And in the distance, almost too faint to hear, came the sound of vehicles on the mountain road, moving slowly but determinedly toward the cabin where two people had dared to choose love over obligation, hope over fear, and each other over everything else their separate worlds had demanded of them. The tablet had been hidden behind a stack of books on the cabin's mantelpiece, forgotten until Jack accidentally knocked it over while adjusting the damper on the fireplace. It clattered to the floor, its screen lighting up automatically to reveal a news website that made Jack's blood run cold. The headline read, "Missing Tech CEO Camille Drake, Kidnapped or Having a Breakdown." Below it was a photograph that had clearly been taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Jack and Camille embracing on the cabin's porch, their faces clearly visible despite the poor image quality. Jack stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the implications. The article, published just hours earlier, painted a picture that bore no resemblance to the reality he'd been living. According to unnamed sources, Camille Drake had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, possibly taken against her will by an unknown individual described as a drifter with a history of financial problems. The article mentioned Jack by name, included details about his eviction from the trailer park, and suggested that he might be holding Camille for ransom or other nefarious purposes. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, scrolling through the article with growing horror. The story included quotes from concerned colleagues worried about Camille's mental state, speculation about whether she'd been coerced into her disappearance, and dark hints about the dangerous individual she'd been seen with. There were even suggestions that Jack might be part of a larger conspiracy to manipulate Drake Industries' stock prices through their CEO's mysterious absence. "Jack?" Camille appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the falling tablet. "What's wrong?" He turned the screen toward her, watching as her face went through the same progression of emotions he'd just experienced. Confusion, shock, then mounting anger. "Those bastards," she whispered, reading over the article. "They're trying to destroy you to get to me." "Who's they?" "My board, my competitors, anyone who benefits from making me look unstable or incompetent." Camille sank onto the couch beside him, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the comments section, which was filled with speculation and condemnation. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Jack read over her shoulder, his own anger building as he saw himself described as everything from a con artist to a potential terrorist. The comments ranged from concerned to vicious, with several people calling for law enforcement to investigate his background and rescue Camille from what was obviously a dangerous situation. "They've made me the villain," Jack said, his voice hollow. "Christ, Camille, there are people calling for the FBI to get involved." "I know, I'm so sorry, Jack. This is my fault." "How is this your fault? You didn't write this article." "But I knew this would happen. I knew that being with me would make you a target, and I let myself ignore it because I wanted—" She trailed off, tears streaming down her face. "Because I wanted to be happy." Jack set the tablet aside and pulled her close, feeling the tremor in her body as she fought to maintain control. "Camille, we can fix this. You can call these reporters, tell them the truth about what's really happening here." "Can I?" "Because the truth is that I did disappear without telling anyone where I was going. I did cut off communication with my company for weeks. And I did get involved with someone I barely knew." She looked up at him with anguish in her eyes. "They've taken the facts and twisted them just enough to make their story believable." Jack studied the article again, noting how skillfully it had been crafted. Nothing in it was technically false, but the implications were devastating. His financial problems were real. Camille's disappearance was real. Their relationship was real. But the context that made those facts meaningful had been stripped away, leaving only a narrative that painted him as a predator and her as a victim. "There's more," Camille said quietly, scrolling to the bottom of the article. "Look at this." The final paragraph mentioned that Drake Industries stock had surged 15% since the kidnapping story broke, as investors apparently viewed Camille's potential victimization as preferable to voluntary abandonment of her company responsibilities. Someone was making millions of dollars from this manufactured crisis. "They're profiting from this," Jack said, the full scope of the manipulation becoming clear. "Someone leaked our location, hired the photographer and fed this story to the press specifically to drive up stock prices and to make sure I have no choice but to come back. Because now, if I don't return immediately and publicly, it will look like I'm either being held against my will or I'm having some kind of mental breakdown." Jack felt a cold weight settling in his stomach as he realized what this meant for their future. "So what do we do?" I don't know. If I go back now and confirm that I was here voluntarily, it will destroy the stock boost, but it will also confirm that I abandoned my responsibilities for a romantic relationship. The board will use that as evidence that I'm unfit for leadership, and if you don't go back, then this story grows bigger. There will be search parties, FBI investigations, media circuses. Your life will be completely destroyed, and eventually, the truth will come out anyway, but by then, the damage will be irreversible. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their impossible situation settling around them like a shroud. Jack thought about all the plans they'd made the night before, all the promises they'd whispered in the darkness. Less than 12 hours ago, he'd believed they could build a life together. Now it seemed like they'd been living in a fantasy that was finally colliding with reality. "There's something else," Camille said, her voice barely audible. "Something I haven't told you." Jack felt his heart skip. "What?" "The reason I really left the company. It wasn't just burnout or a need for space." She took a shaky breath. "There's been a hostile takeover attempt in the works for months. Someone has been systematically buying up shares and positioning themselves to force me out. I think they've been planning this whole thing." "What whole thing?" "Creating a crisis that would either force me back under their terms or make me look so unstable that they could justify removing me entirely." Camille's voice grew stronger as the pieces fell into place. "Think about it. My extended absence creates instability, which drives down stock prices. Then they leak this kidnapping story, which drives prices back up while making me look like either a victim or a lunatic. Either way, they win." Jack stared at her, the scope of the conspiracy beginning to dawn on him. "You're saying this was all planned, that someone orchestrated your disappearance? Not my disappearance, my discovery. They probably had people watching the cabin, waiting for the right moment to document our relationship and spin it into a crisis." Camille's anger was building now, replacing her earlier despair. "I played right into their hands. I gave them exactly what they needed to destroy me, or to destroy us." "Yes." The word was heavy with grief. "Jack, I don't see a way out of this that doesn't hurt you. If I go back and tell the truth, you'll be crucified in the media as the man who seduced a vulnerable CEO. If I don't go back, you'll be investigated as a potential kidnapper. Either way, your life is ruined." Jack looked around the cabin they'd been restoring together, at the tools scattered on the table, at the evidence of the life they'd been building. Less than a day ago, this place had felt like sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap. "What if we run?" he asked. "What if we just disappear, start over somewhere else?" "With what? My accounts are probably frozen by now, and you don't have the resources for that kind of escape. Besides, running would just confirm their story. We'd be fugitives for the rest of our lives." Jack felt the future they'd planned crumbling around them like a house built on sand. The cruelest part was that their love was real, their connection genuine, their plans for the future achievable. If only they'd been allowed to pursue them without interference from a world that saw their happiness as a threat to someone else's ambitions. "I'm going to call them," Camille said, reaching for her phone. "I'm going to call the board and the reporters and everyone else who thinks they own my life, and I'm going to tell them exactly what I think of their manipulation." "Camille, wait." Jack caught her hand. "Think about this. If you lash out now while you're angry, you'll just confirm that you're unstable. You'll be playing into their narrative. Then what do you suggest?" Jack looked at the tablet again, at the photograph of them embracing, at the comments calling for his arrest. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski, who would probably see this story and wonder what kind of man she'd trusted with her trailer. He thought about the few friends he had left, who would read these articles and question everything they thought they knew about him. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to be smarter than they are. We need to control the narrative instead of letting them control it." "How?" "By telling our story first, on our terms, before they can twist it any further." "Camille," studied his face, hope beginning to replace despair in her expression. "You mean go public, together? I mean stop hiding. Stop letting them paint us as predator and victim, and start showing the world what we really are." "Which is what?" Jack took her hands in his, feeling the strength that had carried her through years of corporate battles, the gentleness that had taught him to love again. Two people who found something real in a world full of artificial things. Two people who chose each other over everything else their separate worlds offered them. For the first time since they'd discovered the article, Camille smiled. "You know, that will be the fight of our lives, don't you? They'll come at us with everything they have. Then we'd better make sure we're worth fighting for." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching on the mountain road, not the quiet approach of investigators or reporters, but the deliberate noise of people who wanted to be heard coming. Jack and Camille looked at each other, and in that moment he saw her transform. The frightened woman who'd been hiding in the mountains disappeared, replaced by the CEO who'd built an empire from nothing. But this time, she wasn't facing the fight alone. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," Jack replied, and meant it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The world might try to tear them apart, but it would have to go through both of them to do it. The legal documents arrived by helicopter, which should have been Jack's first clue that this was bigger than corporate gamesmanship. The aircraft landed in the clearing beside the cabin at exactly 9 a.m., disgorging 3 people in dark suits, who moved with the efficiency of a military operation. The lead figure carried a briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear attack, while the other 2 flanked him like bodyguards protecting a head of state. Jack and Camille watched from the cabin's porch, where they'd been drinking coffee and planning their counterattack. The media blitz they'd discussed the night before suddenly seemed woefully inadequate in the face of this escalation. "Ms. Drake," the lead man called out as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "I'm Marcus Webb, senior partner at Hartwell, Stevens & Associates. We represent the Drake Industries Board of Directors." "I know who you are, Marcus." Camille's voice was ice-cold professional. "The question is what you're doing on my property without an invitation. We're here to serve you with these documents." Webb opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder bound with legal ribbons. "A petition for emergency conservatorship, citing your recent erratic behavior and questions about your mental competency." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. "They're trying to have you declared incompetent? It's a standard corporate procedure when a CEO's behavior poses a risk." "To shareholder value," Webb replied smoothly. Ms. Drake's extended absence, her involvement with questionable individuals, and her refusal to respond to board communications all support the petition. Camille descended the porch steps slowly, every movement controlled and deliberate. Jack had seen her transform from frightened refugee to corporate warrior before, but this was different. This was the woman who'd built an empire from nothing, and she was preparing for war. "Let me see those documents." Webb handed over the folder with the satisfaction of someone delivering a fatal blow. But as Camille read through the papers, her expression didn't change from professional curiosity to fear. Instead, something that might have been amusement flickered across her features. "Interesting," she said after several minutes. "Tell me, Marcus, who's funding this petition? Because I know the board doesn't have the resources for helicopter deliveries and emergency legal proceedings. That's confidential information, is it? Because according to these papers, the petitioners include several board members who've been buying up company stock through shell corporations over the past 6 months. That sounds like insider trading to me." Webb's confidence flickered for the first time. "Ms. Drake, I'd advise you to focus on your own legal situation rather than making unfounded accusations. Would you? Because I'm looking at a conspiracy to manipulate stock prices through manufactured crises, force the removal of a sitting CEO through fraudulent mental health claims, and orchestrate what amounts to a corporate coup." Camille's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. How much did they pay you to deliver these papers personally, Marcus? Because if it was less than your normal rate for treason, you got screwed." Jack watched this exchange with growing admiration and terror. Camille was magnificent when she was angry. Brilliant, focused, absolutely ruthless in defense of what she cared about. But he could also see that they were dealing with people who had resources and connections that went far beyond normal corporate warfare. "Ms. Drake," Webb said, his tone becoming threatening, "I'd strongly advise you to consider the implications of your situation. Your association with Mr. Brenner has already raised serious questions about your judgment. Continuing to resist the board's reasonable concerns will only make things worse. Worse for whom? For everyone involved. Mr. Brenner's background has come under scrutiny, and there are irregularities that could prove embarrassing if they became public." Jack felt ice form in his stomach. What kind of irregularities? The kind that happen when someone investigates your finances, your employment history, your personal relationships. Webb's smile was predatory. Amazing what can be discovered when you have the right resources and motivation. "You're threatening him," Camille said, her voice deadly quiet. "I'm informing you both of the reality of your situation. Ms. Drake, you can return to your responsibilities willingly and put this unfortunate episode behind you, or you can continue down a path that will destroy not only your career, but Mr. Brenner's future as well." The silence that followed was loaded with violence barely held in check. Jack could see Camille calculating, weighing options, trying to find a path that didn't sacrifice either her principles or his safety. "I need time to review these documents," she said finally. "You have 24 hours to respond. After that, the petition moves forward regardless of your cooperation." Webb and his companions returned to their helicopter, leaving Jack and Camille standing in the artificial wind generated by its departure. The machine rose into the morning sky like a mechanical predator, disappearing beyond the mountain peaks with military precision. "They're not bluffing," Camille said once the noise faded. "A conservatorship would give them complete control over my assets, my company, even my personal decisions. I'd be legally declared incompetent to manage my own life." "Can they actually do that? If they can prove I'm mentally unstable, yes. And unfortunately, disappearing into the mountains for weeks without explanation, getting involved with someone I barely knew, and refusing to respond to corporate communications could all be interpreted as evidence of instability." Jack looked at the legal documents in her hands, thick with official seals and threatening language. "What about the insider trading angle? Can't you fight back with that?" "I can try, but proving it would take months, maybe years. And in the meantime, they'd have control of everything." Camille sank onto the porch steps, suddenly looking exhausted. "Jack, I think they've beaten us. They've created a situation where any choice I make hurts someone I care about." "What do you mean? If I fight this, they'll destroy you. Your finances, your reputation, maybe even your freedom. They'll manufacture evidence if they have to. But if I give in and return to the company, I'll be admitting that our relationship was a mistake, a sign of mental instability that required corporate intervention to correct." Jack sat beside her, studying the mountains that surrounded their sanctuary. 3 weeks ago, this place had felt like the middle of nowhere. Now it felt like the center of a storm that was gathering strength with each passing hour. "There's a third option," he said quietly, "which is we disappear, really disappear this time. Take whatever money you can access and vanish completely." Camille was quiet for a long moment. "I've thought about that. But running would mean abandoning 10,000 employees, billions in shareholder value, and a company I spent 15 years building. It would also mean living as fugitives for the rest of our lives. Would that be so bad if we had each other?" "Jack, you don't understand what that would really mean. We'd never be able to use credit cards, rent apartments in our real names, or have any kind of normal life. We'd be looking over our shoulders forever, wondering when they'd find us." Jack thought about this while watching a hawk circle overhead, free to go wherever the wind carried it. "What if we don't run and we don't Surrender? What if we attack? How? By doing exactly what we talked about yesterday. Going public with our story, but not defensively, aggressively. We expose the whole conspiracy, the stock manipulation, the manufactured crisis, the coordinated attempt to remove you from your own company. That's incredibly risky. If we can't prove everything we're alleging, then we're no worse off than we are now. But if we can prove even part of it, we shift the narrative from your mental stability to their criminal conspiracy. Camille stood and began pacing the length of the porch, her mind working through possibilities and consequences. Jack could almost see her calculating odds, weighing strategies, preparing for a battle that would determine not just their future together, but the fate of everything she'd built. "We'd need evidence," she said finally. "Documentation of the stock purchases, records of their communications, proof that they orchestrated the media coverage. Do you have access to that kind of information?" "Some of it. And I know people who might help if they understand what's really at stake." She stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "But Jack, if we do this, there's no going back. We'll be declaring war on some very powerful people, and they'll use every weapon they have against us." "What weapons do we have?" "The truth, your integrity, my knowledge of how they operate." Camille's smile was grim but determined. "And the fact that they've underestimated both of us. They spent the rest of the morning planning their counterattack." Camille made encrypted calls to journalists she trusted, lawyers who weren't afraid of powerful opponents, and former employees who'd left the company under suspicious circumstances. Jack researched the board members named in the conservatorship petition, tracing connections and financial relationships that painted a picture of coordinated manipulation. By afternoon, they had the skeleton of a strategy, a press conference. The next morning, coordinated media releases and a lawsuit alleging securities fraud and conspiracy. It was aggressive, risky, and potentially devastating to everyone involved. "Are you sure about this?" Camille asked as they reviewed their plans. "Once we start, they'll come at us with everything they have. Your life will never be private again." Jack looked around the cabin they'd been restoring together, at the evidence of the life they'd begun to build. Then he looked at Camille. Brilliant, fierce, and more vulnerable than she'd ever let anyone see. "I'm sure," he said, "but I want you to be sure too. Because if we do this, we're not just fighting for our relationship, we're fighting for the right to choose our own lives instead of letting other people choose for us." "I've been letting other people choose for me my entire career," Camille replied. "I think it's time I started making my own decisions." As the sun set behind the mountains, they held each other on the porch where they'd first admitted their love, watching the stars appear in a sky that seemed infinite and full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring the fight of their lives, but tonight they had each other and the quiet certainty that whatever happened, they'd face it together. In the distance, almost too faint to hear, came the sound of helicopters approaching through the mountain passes. The enemy was returning in force, but this time Jack and Camille were ready for them. The cabin deed lay spread across the kitchen table like a battle map, its official seals and legal language transforming what had been their breakfast space into a war room. Camille had produced the document that morning from a locked box she'd kept hidden in her bedroom, and Jack was still processing the implications of what it meant. "You own this place outright," he said, running his finger along the property boundaries marked on the attached survey. "No mortgage, no liens, no corporate entanglements. My grandfather left it to me personally, not to any business entity. It's one of the few things in my life that truly belongs to me." Camille's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. "I'd forgotten what that felt like until I came here." Jack studied the deed more carefully, noting the date of transfer and the language of inheritance. "Camille, this is worth millions. Prime mountain real estate, water rights, timber rights. You could sell this and live comfortably for the rest of your life without ever working again." "I know, that's why I want to give it to you." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He looked up from the document to find Camille watching him with absolute seriousness, no trace of jest or impulse in her expression. "You want to what? Transfer. Ownership to you. Today, before the press conference, before the legal battle really begins." Camille pulled a second set of documents from the box, transfer papers that had already been partially filled out. "If they succeed in having me declared incompetent, they'll freeze all my assets, but this place would still be yours, free and clear." Jack pushed back from the table, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering. "Camille, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's not a gift, it's an investment. In us, in our future, in the possibility that we can build something that belongs to us instead of to shareholders or board members or anyone else who thinks they have a claim on our lives. But if things don't work out between us, then you'll own a beautiful piece of property, and I'll have the satisfaction of knowing it went to someone who appreciates what it really represents." Camille's smile was soft but determined. "Jack, you've shown me what it means to build something with your own hands, to create value that isn't measured in stock prices or quarterly reports. This cabin is proof that I can be more than just a CEO. I can be someone who makes things instead of just managing them." Jack looked around the space they'd been transforming together, the restored window frames, the repaired porch, the kitchen where they'd shared so many meals and conversations. Every improvement represented hours of work they'd done side by side, decisions they'd made together, problems they'd solved as a team. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not wait to see how the legal battle turns out? Because if we wait, it might be too late. Once they freeze my assets, I won't be able to transfer anything. And—" she paused, gathering courage, "because I want you to know that my commitment to this relationship isn't dependent on keeping my company or my wealth. Whatever happens with Drake Industries, I want to build a life with you." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted Jack's response. Through the kitchen window, they could see a convoy of cars and trucks making their way up the mountain road. Reporters, camera crews, and the advance team for the press conference they'd scheduled for noon. "They're early," Camille observed, checking her watch. "We still have an hour before the scheduled start. Maybe they got wind of what we're planning to reveal." Jack watched the vehicles deploy around the cabin clearing with military precision. Satellite trucks extended their equipment, while camera crews set up shots of the cabin from multiple angles. Within minutes, their peaceful sanctuary had been transformed into a media circus. "Miss Drake," a reporter called out as soon as Camille appeared on the porch. "Can you comment on the board's petition for conservatorship?" "That's what the press conference is for," Camille replied smoothly, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders as she faced the crowd of journalists and cameras. "Mr. Brenner," another voice called out, "how do you respond to allegations that you've been manipulating Ms. Drake for financial gain?" Jack felt anger flare in his chest, but Camille's hand on his arm reminded him to stay calm. They'd anticipated these questions, prepared responses that would serve their larger strategy. "Mr. Brenner and I will address all questions during our formal statement," Camille said. "Until then, you're on private property, and I'd appreciate if you'd respect appropriate boundaries." But even as she spoke, Jack could see more vehicles arriving, not just media, but official-looking cars with government plates and SUVs that screamed corporate power. Whatever battle they'd planned to fight was about to get much bigger and more complicated. "Camille," he said quietly, "I think we need to accelerate our timeline." She followed his gaze to the new arrivals and nodded grimly. "Get the transfer papers. If we're going to do this, it has to be now." They retreated to the cabin while chaos organized itself in the clearing outside. Camille signed the deed transfer with quick, decisive strokes, while Jack read through the legal language one more time, still struggling to accept the enormity of what she was giving him. "There," she said, pushing the completed documents across the table. "Now sign before I lose my nerve." Jack hesitated, pen in hand. "Camille, are you absolutely sure about this? Once I sign, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," He signed his name carefully, the weight of the moment settling around them like morning mist. In the space of a few pen strokes, he'd gone from being a homeless handyman to the owner of a multi-million-dollar mountain property. But more than that, he'd become the keeper of Camille's deepest sanctuary, the guardian of the place where she'd rediscovered who she really was. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we go outside and tell the world our story. The real story, not the version they've been fed by people who think they own us." But before they could move toward the door, it burst open to admit Marcus Webb and two other men in expensive suits, followed closely by a woman Jack didn't recognize, but who carried herself with the authority of a federal agent. "Ms. Drake," Webb said, his voice triumphant, "I'm here to serve you with an emergency injunction, preventing you from making any financial transfers or business decisions pending resolution of the conservatorship petition." Camille looked at the legal papers he thrust toward her, then at Jack, then back at Webb with a smile that was pure predatory satisfaction. "I'm afraid you're about 5 minutes too late, Marcus. The transfer was completed before you arrived." Webb's confident expression cracked. "What transfer?" "The one that just made Mr. Brenner the legal owner of this property. You might want to add that to your files." The federal agent stepped forward, showing her credentials. "Ms. Drake, I'm Agent Patricia Morrison with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have some questions about recent trading activity in Drake Industries stock." Jack felt the situation spiraling beyond their control. What had started as a press conference to tell their side of the story was becoming a three-ring circus of legal proceedings, federal investigations, and corporate warfare. "Gentlemen, lady," Camille said with icy politeness, "unless you have warrants or court orders, you're trespassing on private property, Mr. Brenner's private property, to be specific." All eyes turned to Jack, who suddenly found himself at the center of a power struggle he barely understood. The woman he loved had just made him a millionaire and simultaneously handed him the responsibility for protecting both their futures. "She's right," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is private property, and I'm asking all of you to leave unless you have legal authority to be here." "Mr. Brenner," Agent Morrison said, "we're investigating potential securities fraud and market manipulation. Your cooperation would be appreciated." "Then you can make an appointment through my attorney," Jack replied, the words feeling strange in his mouth. A week ago, he hadn't been able to afford a lawyer. Now he was talking like someone who had teams of them. Webb tried a different approach. "Mr. Brenner, you should understand that accepting this property transfer could make you complicit in Ms. Drake's alleged financial improprieties. You might want to reconsider your position." Jack looked at Camille, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He thought about the past weeks, about the woman who'd taught him to make perfect scrambled eggs and learned to sand wood with such careful attention. He thought about the way she'd touched his injured back with healing hands, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth loving. "My position," Jack said clearly, "is that Camille Drake is the most competent, intelligent, and principled person I've ever met. If you think she's done something wrong, prove it in court. Until then, get off our property." The silence that followed was loaded with implications and threats. Jack could see Webb calculating new strategies while Agent Morrison assessed the situation for federal involvement. But he could also see something else in Camille's expression: gratitude, love, and the fierce determination of someone who'd found something worth fighting for. "This isn't over," Webb said finally. "No," Camille replied, moving to stand beside Jack. "It's just beginning." As the officials retreated to regroup with the media circus outside, Jack and Camille stood in their kitchen now, holding hands and preparing for the battle that would determine whether love and truth could triumph over power and manipulation. Outside, cameras were rolling and reporters were shouting questions, but inside the cabin, two people who'd chosen each other over everything else their separate worlds had offered them were ready to fight for the right to build a life together. The house keys were simple brass, worn smooth by decades of use, hanging from a keychain that read, "Home Sweet Home," in faded blue letters. Jack turned them over in his palm as he and Camille stood on the porch, looking out at the media circus that had transformed their sanctuary into a battlefield. These keys to the cabin that was now legally his represented everything they were fighting for and everything they stood to lose. "Ready?" Camille asked, straightening her shoulders and transforming once again into the CEO who'd built an empire. "From nothing. Ready," Jack replied, though his heart was pounding so hard he was sure the microphones would pick it up. They walked down the porch steps together, facing a sea of cameras and reporters who had been waiting for this moment. Jack counted at least 30 journalists, plus camera crews from major networks, plus the government officials who'd retreated to the edge of the clearing but were obviously recording everything. Camille stepped up to the makeshift podium someone had set up, looking completely comfortable under the glare of media attention. Jack stood beside her, acutely aware that his every expression was being broadcast live to millions of people around the world. "Thank you all for coming," Camille began, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I called this press conference to address the false narratives and malicious speculation that have been circulating about my personal life and professional decisions." A reporter immediately shouted a question, but Camille continued without acknowledging the interruption. "3 weeks ago, I made a personal decision to take time away from my company responsibilities to reassess my priorities and determine how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. During that time, I met Jack Brenner, a skilled craftsman who was hired to restore this cabin. What began as a professional relationship developed into something personal and meaningful. Jack felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him as cameras zoomed in for close-ups. He'd never imagined he'd be standing in front of the world's media, defending his relationship with one of America's most powerful CEOs. "Mr. Brenner and I fell in love," Camille continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not because he sought me out for my wealth. He didn't even know who I was when we met. Not because I was seeking a romantic escape from corporate pressure. I was seeking solitude and space to think. We fell in love because we discovered that we share values, mutual respect, and a vision for what a meaningful life could look like." Another barrage of shouted questions, which Camille again ignored. "What we discovered here, together, is that it's possible to build something real and lasting through honest work, genuine connection, and shared commitment to each other's well-being. Unfortunately, certain parties have attempted to weaponize our relationship for their own financial and political gain." Marcus Webb stepped forward from the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "Ms. Drake, you abandoned your fiduciary responsibilities to 10,000 employees and billions in shareholder value for a romantic affair with a man you barely knew." Camille's smile was ice-cold. "Marcus, I'm glad you brought that up, because what you just described as abandonment, I call taking the first vacation I've had in 5 years. And what you call a romantic affair, I call falling in love and getting engaged." The crowd erupted. Jack felt his knees nearly buckle as reporters shouted questions about engagement rings and wedding plans, while cameras swiveled to capture his shocked expression. "That's right," Camille continued, reaching for Jack's hand. "This morning, Jack Brenner asked me to marry him, and I said yes, not because he wants my money. In fact, he's spent the past hour trying to convince me to take back the property. Deed I transferred to him as an engagement gift. He asked me to marry him because we've discovered that we're better together than we are apart." Jack stared at her, his mind reeling. They hadn't discussed engagement, hadn't planned this revelation. But as Camille looked at him with absolute trust and love, he realized she was giving him a choice: support her strategy or let her face this. "Battle alone. Ms. Drake," he said clearly, loud enough for all the microphones to pick up, "I asked you to marry me because you're the most remarkable person I've ever known, not because you're wealthy or powerful, but because you're kind, intelligent, hardworking, and brave enough to choose love over fear. The crowd quieted, sensing that something significant was happening. "I'm a carpenter," Jack continued, feeling more confident as he spoke from the heart. "I make things with my hands, I fix things that are broken, and I try to leave places better. Then I found them. Camille saw that in me when no one else did. She worked beside me, learned my trade, shared my meals, and treated me like an equal partner in everything we did together." Agent Morrison pushed forward from the crowd. "Mr. Brenner, are you aware that Ms. Drake transferred millions of dollars in real estate to you this morning? How do you explain that if not as payment for services rendered?" "I can explain it very simply," Jack replied. "The woman I love wanted to make sure that whatever happened with her corporate battles, we'd have a place to build our life together. She gave me this property the same way I gave her my heart, completely without reservation, because that's what people do when they're committed to a shared future." "And what about the allegations of stock manipulation?" another reporter called out. Camille stepped back to the microphone. "I'm glad you asked, because while I've been here learning to build things with my hands, certain board members have been busy manipulating stock prices through coordinated trading, manufacturing crises to drive down share values, and attempting to remove me from my own company through false allegations of mental incompetence." She pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I have evidence of illegal insider trading, securities fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate market prices. This evidence has been turned over to the SEC and will be the basis for criminal charges against several individuals who thought they could destroy my personal life to advance their corporate ambitions." Webb's face went pale. "Those are serious allegations, Ms. Drake. I hope you can substantiate them." "I can and I will, starting with recorded phone conversations, email communications, and financial records that show a coordinated effort to force my return to the company under terms favorable to a hostile takeover attempt." Jack watched the crowd as the implications of Camille's revelations sank in. The story was no longer about a CEO's romantic escapade. It was about corporate conspiracy and criminal behavior. The narrative had shifted completely. "Furthermore," Camille continued, "I'm announcing my intention to step down as CEO of Drake Industries, effective immediately. Not because I've been forced out by corporate manipulation, but because I've discovered that there are more important things than corporate success. I'm choosing to build a life based on love, creativity, and meaningful work rather than endless pursuit of profit and power." The crowd exploded with questions, but Camille held up her hand for silence. "Jack and I will be moving forward with our engagement and our life together. We'll be restoring this cabin and the surrounding property, and I'll be starting a foundation. He focused on supporting craftspeople and traditional building arts. As for Drake Industries, I'm confident that the talented people who work there will continue to innovate and succeed without my involvement." She stepped back from the microphone and looked at Jack with the expression that asked, "Are you with me?" Jack stepped forward, taking the microphone in hands that were steadier than he'd expected. "I want to say something to everyone who's been following this story," he said. 3 weeks ago, I was a man who'd lost almost everything. My wife to cancer, my savings to medical bills, my home to financial hardship. I came here looking for work that would put food on my table and a roof over my head." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "What I found was a woman who saw past my circumstances to who I really was. A woman who worked beside me not because she had to, but because she wanted to learn and contribute. A woman who treated me with respect and kindness when I had nothing to offer except honest work and genuine care." Jack's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Camille Drake didn't need to fall in love with a broke carpenter. She chose to, because love isn't about matching bank accounts or social status. It's about recognizing something valuable in another person and being willing to build a life together based on trust, respect, and shared values." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass keys to their cabin. "These keys represent our future together. Not a future built on corporate profits or stock prices, but a future built on the foundation of a relationship that has already proven it can withstand the worst kind of pressure and manipulation. Jack looked directly at the cameras, knowing that his words were being broadcast around the world. We're not running away from anything. We're running towards something better, a life where we measure success by the strength of our relationship, the beauty of what we build together, and the positive impact we have on the people around us. He stepped back and took Camille's hand, and together they faced the storm of questions and camera flashes that followed. But Jack wasn't focused on the media circus anymore. He was looking at the woman beside him, the woman who'd chosen him over everything else her world had to offer, and planning the life they were going to build together in the sanctuary they'd found in the mountains. The keys to that future were literally in his hand, and for the first time in years, Jack Brenner knew exactly where he was going. The 2 coffee mugs sat on the kitchen table where they'd been placed every morning for the past 6 months, their ceramic surfaces worn smooth by daily use and careful washing. One was blue with a chip on the handle that Jack had been meaning to repair but had grown fond of instead. The other was plain white, simple and practical, the kind of cup that felt good in your hands when you needed something solid and real to hold on to. Jack reached for his blue mug, savoring the ritual that had become as essential to his day as breathing. The coffee was good, better than good actually, because Camille had developed strong opinions about bean quality and grinding techniques during their months together. But more than the coffee, he treasured these quiet morning moments when they sat together watching the sun rise over the mountains, planning their day without urgency or external pressure. The foundation paperwork came through yesterday, Camille said, settling into her chair with her white mug cradled in both hands. We're officially approved to start the first apprenticeship program next month. Jack smiled, remembering the long nights they'd spent designing the program that would bring young people to their mountain property to learn traditional building crafts from master artisans. The Brenner Drake Foundation for Traditional Arts had grown from a casual conversation into a full-fledged organization that was already attracting attention from craftspeople around the country. Mrs. Kowalski's grandson is still interested in the carpentry track. Very interested. She says he's been practicing joints and asking about the application process every week. Camille's smile was fond. She also says she never doubted you'd land on your feet, even when things looked darkest. Jack thought about Mrs. Kowalski, who had indeed rented his trailer space to someone else, but had called to congratulate him when the story of his relationship with Camille had shifted from scandal to fairy tale. The media narrative had changed completely once the corporate conspiracy had been exposed, transforming them from predator and victim into a modern love story that people couldn't get enough of. Any word on the criminal proceedings? Marcus Webb and 3 board members were indicted last week. The SEC is calling it one of the most sophisticated market manipulation schemes they've seen. Camille's expression grew serious. They're facing serious prison time if convicted. Jack nodded, still amazed by how quickly the legal situation had resolved once Camille's evidence had been presented to federal investigators. The stock manipulation scheme had been even more extensive than they'd realized, involving multiple companies and potentially hundreds of millions in illegal profits. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, the question that had been on his mind more frequently as the dust settled from their public battle. Walking away from the company, giving up that life. Camille was quiet for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the garden they'd been expanding throughout the summer. Rows of vegetables grew in neat lines between fruit trees they'd planted in the spring, and a greenhouse Jack had built stood ready for the winter crops they'd planned together. "I regret that it took me so long to realize what I really wanted," she said finally. "I regret the years I spent building something that ultimately belonged more to other people than to me, but walking away from it, choosing this life with you. I've never been more certain of anything, Jack followed her gaze to the garden, then beyond it to the workshop, where 3 apprentice carpenters were already at work despite the early hour. The sound of hand tools and quiet conversation drifted through the morning air, mixing with the songs of birds and the distant sound of water running over rocks in the creek that bordered their property. The past 6 months had transformed the mountain property from a neglected retreat into a working ranch dedicated to preserving and teaching traditional crafts. The main cabin had been fully restored, its logs glowing with the warm patina that came from proper care and attention. 3 smaller cabins housed visiting artisans and apprentices, while the workshop complex had grown to include spaces for woodworking, blacksmithing, and textile arts. "I love watching you work with the apprentices," Camille said, interrupting his thoughts. "You have your father's gift for teaching, but you explain things in ways that make sense to modern minds. They're good kids, eager to learn, respectful of the traditions." Jack smiled, thinking about the young woman who'd driven up from California to learn timber framing, or the former tech worker who discovered a passion for hand-tool woodworking. "Sometimes I think we're not just teaching them crafts, we're showing them that there are alternatives to the world that told them success only comes from climbing corporate ladders. Is that what we're doing? Providing alternatives? Among other things." Jack reached across the table and took her hand, marveling as he did every day at how natural the gesture had become. "Mostly, I think we're proving that it's possible to build a life based on what you value instead of what other people expect from you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning light strengthen and spread across the valley below them. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, the nearest town 15 miles of winding mountain road, yet Jack had never felt less isolated. The steady stream of visiting artisans, apprentices, and craftspeople had created a community that felt both intimate and connected to the larger world. "Jack," Camille said softly, "do you remember what you said the first morning we had coffee together? About Sarah teaching you that the most generous thing you could give someone was space to be themselves without judgment?" "I remember. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how rare that kind of generosity really is and how much courage it takes to offer it." She looked at him directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You gave me that gift from the very beginning. You saw who I could be instead of who I was supposed to be." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You gave me the same gift. When I had nothing to offer except honest work, you treated me like someone worth knowing. We saved each other." "We did." The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted their moment, followed by a gentle knock on the door. Jack opened it too. "Find Elena, one of their textile apprentices, holding a package that had obviously arrived by overnight delivery." "This came for you, Ms. Drake," Elena said, handing over the package with obvious curiosity. "The driver said it was urgent." Camille examined the return address and smiled. "It's from my sister. I think she's finally ready to visit." Jack had heard stories about Camille's younger sister, a teacher in Oregon, who had been wary of the media, a tension surrounding their relationship, but supportive of Camille's choices. The prospect of meeting more of Camille's family filled him with nervous excitement. "What do you think she sent?" Camille opened the package carefully, revealing a wooden box that was clearly handmade. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 2 ceramic mugs. One blue, one white, but clearly crafted as a pair by someone who understood the importance of simple, beautiful objects. A note was tucked inside. "For your morning coffee ritual. I made these in my pottery class, thinking about the new tradition you're building together. Can't wait to meet the man who helped my sister remember who she really is. Love, Rebecca." Jack picked up one of the new mugs, admiring the weight and balance, the slight variations that marked it as handmade rather than mass-produced. "They're beautiful. They're perfect." Camille held the other mug, comparing it to their well-worn daily cups. "Should we retire the old ones?" Jack looked at their chipped and stained mugs, then at the pristine new ones, then back at Camille. "What do you think?" "I think," Camille said, setting down the new mug and picking up her familiar white cup, that these new ones will be perfect for special occasions and visiting family. But these old ones have too much history to retire. Jack nodded, understanding completely. The mugs they'd been using had witnessed their first tentative conversations, their growing intimacy, their plans for the future, and their quiet celebrations of small daily victories. They'd held coffee during legal battles and romantic mornings, through seasons of uncertainty and months of building something lasting together. Besides, Camille added with a smile, I like the chip in yours. It makes it uniquely ours. They returned to their morning routine, but with a new awareness of how much their simple rituals meant. In 6 months, they'd gone from strangers to partners, to fiancés, to business collaborators, to the founders of an enterprise that was already making a difference in dozens of young lives. But the foundation of it all remained these quiet morning moments when they planned their day together over coffee and conversation. What's on the schedule today? Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. Workshop supervision until lunch, foundation paperwork this afternoon, and dinner with the new metalworking instructor who's arriving this evening. Camille paused, then smiled. And somewhere in there, I thought we might finally set a date for the wedding. Jack nearly choked on his coffee. Really? Really? I was thinking October, when the leaves are changing. Simple ceremony, just family, and the people who matter most to us. Maybe Rebecca could make our wedding mugs to go with the everyday ones. October sounds perfect. Jack reached for her hand again, still amazed by how much his life had changed since that desperate morning, when he'd found a mysterious job posting on a community bulletin board. Camille? Yes, I love you. Not for what you've given me or what you've made possible, but for who you are when it's just us, sitting here planning our day. I love you too, for seeing possibilities where other people see problems, for building things that last, and for being brave enough to choose love, even when it was risky. They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. Around them, their community was waking up. Apprentices heading to workshops, visiting artisans, examining projects they'd started the day. Before, the quiet hum of productive work beginning another day. But in the kitchen of the restored cabin, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds sat with their worn coffee mugs and planned a future that belonged entirely to them. The world might continue to spin with its corporate conspiracies and media circuses, but here in the mountains, love had proven stronger than manipulation, and authenticity had triumphed over artifice. Jack looked at the woman across from him, brilliant, kind, endlessly surprising, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from building something real with his own hands. Their relationship, their community, their shared commitment to values that couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly reports. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of legacy his father and grandfather would have been proud of. Not because it was profitable or impressive, but because it was built to last.